If you say the wrong word to a queen, the best outcome is silence, Ethan Cole had once been told. But standing beneath a ceiling that pulsed like a living sky, he was starting to suspect silence here meant something far worse. The royal chamber of Valus Prime did not feel built so much as grown, its towering arches curving like the ribs of something ancient and patient, light drifting in slow currents that adjusted to every breath, every shift of posture, as if the room itself were quietly judging who deserved to stand inside it. And Ethan, with his slightly wrinkled uniform and a badge that barely cleared mid-level clearance, was fairly certain he did not. He kept his hands loosely behind his back, the way protocol suggested, though mostly to stop himself from fidgeting, and focused on breathing evenly, which was harder than it sounded when gravity felt just a fraction lighter than Earth's standard, and every step threatened to remind him that this was not his world. Around him, diplomats spoke in carefully measured tones. Their words filtered through translation fields that hummed softly like restrained machinery, while the alien courtiers listened with stillness so complete it bordered on theatrical, their long, elegant ears angled in subtle shifts that Ethan had learned, badly, to interpret as everything from mild interest to quiet disapproval. He had been in this chamber for exactly 42 minutes, long enough to realize that time here did not pass so much as accumulate, pressing down in layers until even simple thoughts felt heavier than they should. He was not supposed to speak. Not really. His role was observational, supplemental at best, a human attachment to a negotiation that would proceed perfectly fine without him, and he was comfortable with that. Invisibility was a skill he had cultivated over years of being underestimated, and he wore it well. Then the chamber changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle way a room shifts when something important enters and reality itself leans forward to pay attention. Conversations did not stop, but they thinned, stretched, softened at the edges, and the light overhead slowed its drift by a degree so small it might have been imagined. Ethan felt it before he saw her, the presence of Queen Lyra Valus, not as a spectacle, but as a correction, like the room adjusting itself around a fixed point. She moved through the chamber with controlled precision, her posture effortless, her expression calm in a way that suggested not peace, but mastery. And when her gaze passed over the assembled delegates, it did not linger. It assessed, categorized, and moved on, efficient as a system that had no need to hesitate. Ethan kept his eyes forward, because looking too directly at a queen without cause was the kind of mistake people remembered for the rest of their lives, however long those happened to be. But something in his peripheral vision pulled at him, a subtle delay, a fraction of a second longer than expected, and before he could stop himself, he glanced up. Queen Lyra was looking at him, not through him, not past him, at him, her eyes steady, curious in a way that felt less like interest and more like recognition misplaced in time. Ethan held the look for exactly one heartbeat before lowering his gaze again, because anything longer would have been a statement, and he had no idea what statement he was accidentally making. Internally, he ran through a rapid checklist of possible errors. Uniform incorrect, posture off, breathing too noticeable, existence fundamentally flawed, and found no immediate answers, which was somehow worse. He told himself it was nothing. A coincidence, a trick of perspective, the kind of thing that happened when you stood in a room designed to make you feel small. But the thought didn't settle. It lingered, quiet and persistent, like a question that refused to be dismissed. The negotiations continued, voices rising and falling in measured cadence, until a pause opened, deliberate and expectant, and one of the senior delegates faltered, just enough, just long enough, for attention to shift in the wrong direction, toward Ethan. He felt it immediately, the weight of being noticed, the subtle recalibration of the room as it waited to see what the least important person in it would do next, and for a brief, unhelpful moment, his mind offered exactly one thought. This is new. Queen Lyra's voice followed, calm, precise, directed not at the delegate who had hesitated, but at him. You, she said, and the single word carried across the chamber with perfect clarity. Answer. Ethan did not move immediately, which in his experience was the closest thing to a survival instinct that looked like professionalism, because when a queen pointed at you and asked for an answer in a room designed to measure worth in silence, The worst possible response was to rush. He lifted his head slowly, as if the motion had been planned rather than forced, and met Queen Lyra's gaze again, aware that every other presence in the chamber had already gone still in anticipation, like a system, waiting for input that might break it. The question itself had not been complex. A clarification on trade corridor access and shared oversight protocols, something he had heard discussed for the past 42 minutes in increasingly polite circles. But the weight of answering it directly to her shifted the problem from language to consequence. He could feel the translation field adjusting around him, its soft hum sharpening slightly, ready to carry his words farther than they had any right to go. And for a moment he considered deflecting, offering a safe, non-committal response, something forgettable, something that would return him to the comfortable category of background detail. Instead, he spoke. The current structure assumes mutual trust without defining enforcement, he said, voice steady enough to surprise him, which works until it does not, and then it fails all at once. The words settled into the chamber with more weight than he intended, not because they were bold, but because they were direct, and directness in a room built on careful phrasing was a kind of disruption. He felt it ripple outward, subtle shifts in posture, a faint tightening in the air, the way attention sharpened when something slightly out of place refused to correct itself. Queen Lyra did not interrupt, which was either permission or a test, and Ethan had no way of knowing which one was worse. He continued, because stopping halfway through a thought in front of a queen seemed like an even faster path to regret. If you want shared oversight, he added, you need a mechanism that assumes disagreement, not agreement. He paused, just long enough to register that he was still speaking, still standing, still not being escorted out of the chamber by very calm and very efficient guards, which felt like a promising trend. Then the thought slipped, not dramatically, not with intent, but with the quiet inevitability of habit crossing into the wrong context. I understand your position, he said, leaning slightly forward without realizing it, the way he would in a conversation meant to reassure rather than impress. My love. The word left his mouth with perfect clarity, carried instantly by the translation field, refined, amplified, delivered to every corner of the chamber with a precision that felt almost personal. For a fraction of a second, Ethan did not process what he had said, because in his world, in smaller rooms with lower ceilings and less consequence, it had always been a harmless phrase, a softener, a human reflex to ease tension. Then reality caught up. The chamber did not go quiet. It stopped. The ambient hum of the translation field faltered just enough to become noticeable. Light overhead stilled mid-shift as if reconsidering its own existence, and somewhere to his left, a data slate slipped from someone's hand and struck the floor with a sound that felt louder than physics should have allowed. Ethan straightened. Instinctively, every internal system suddenly very interested in damage control. But there was no version of that sentence that could be retrieved, no adjustment that could make it appropriate after the fact. He did not look away this time, because looking away would have been an admission, and he was not entirely sure what he would be admitting to. Queen Lyra remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, but something in her focus sharpened, her attention narrowing with a precision that felt less like offense and more like examination. Her ears, those subtle indicators of everything no one said out loud, angled forward by a degree so slight it might have been imagined. Except nothing in this room happened by accident. The guards did not move, which was almost more unsettling than if they had. Their stillness held in place by an unspoken command that had not yet been given. The court waited, the kind of waiting that stretched time thin and fragile, balanced entirely on what the queen would decide to do next. Ethan became aware of his own breathing, steady but deliberate. Each inhale measured as if the air might run out if he was careless. He had expected correction, perhaps dismissal, possibly a lesson delivered with formal clarity, something that would restore order and remind everyone, including him, exactly where he stood. Instead, Queen Lyra stepped forward, a single controlled movement that closed the distance between them just enough to shift the entire balance of the room. She studied him, not with anger, not even with visible irritation, but with a level of attention that felt far more dangerous, as if she were comparing what she saw to something that did not quite match. When she spoke, her voice was lower, quieter, but it carried with absolute precision, requiring no amplification to reach every ear. "You choose your words," she said, not as a question, not quite as an accusation, as if they belong here. The statement hung between them, unresolved, and for the first time since the word had left his mouth, Ethan realized the situation had not collapsed in the way he expected. It had shifted, and he was no longer entirely certain which direction it was moving. No one spoke, which in a chamber like this was not hesitation but permission for something unusual to continue, and Ethan found himself standing in the exact same place, yet no longer in the same position, because whatever boundary he had crossed with a single misplaced word had not pushed him out. It had drawn attention inward. He exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but to buy time, because time here seemed to stretch differently, each second long enough to reconsider an entire lifetime of decisions, and right now his most recent one was still echoing through the room in a way he could not take back. Queen Lyra did not move away, which meant the distance between them remained deliberate, measured in inches that felt far more significant than the dozens of feet that separated him from anyone else. Her gaze held steady on his, not demanding submission, not offering dismissal, but waiting, and the realization settled in with uncomfortable clarity that she expected an answer, not to the room, not to the negotiation, but to her. Ethan's mind supplied several responses, most of them safer than the truth, all of them inadequate, and he dismissed them one by one with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required choosing the least incorrect option rather than the most correct one. "That was not intentional," he said finally, his voice even, though he did not look away, because looking away now would have reduced the statement to an apology, and he was not entirely certain that was what she wanted. A faint shift passed through the chamber, subtle enough that it might have been imagined, but Ethan felt it anyway. The collective adjustment of expectation as everyone recalibrated around a situation that no longer followed protocol. Queen Lyra tilted her head by a fraction, the movement precise, controlled, and somehow more revealing than any overt reaction would have been. "You speak," she said, her tone measured, as if familiarity is natural to you. The words were not sharp, not accusatory, but they carried a weight that suggested they were being placed carefully, tested for alignment rather than thrown for effect. Ethan considered that, because it was not entirely wrong, and answering incorrectly now felt like it would matter in a way that extended far beyond this room. "Familiarity is how humans reduce tension," he replied, allowing a trace of dry humor to edge into his voice, not enough to challenge, just enough to remain himself. "We say things that do not belong to make situations feel like they do." A few of the nearby delegates shifted, the kind of movement people made when they were not supposed to react, but could not quite stop themselves, and Ethan registered it without looking, because right now the only reaction that mattered was directly in front of him. Queen Lyra's eyes narrowed, slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if she were adjusting her understanding of him in real time, and for a brief moment, something passed through her expression that did not align with authority or expectation, something quieter, almost reflective. "And you believe this situation requires reduction," she said. Ethan allowed himself the smallest pause, enough to acknowledge the weight of the question without turning it into hesitation. "I believe," he said carefully, "that this situation already exceeded what I understand." The honesty of it settled into the space between them, unpolished but stable, and for a heartbeat the chamber seemed to hold itself in that admission, as if unsure whether to accept it or correct it. Then something shifted again, not in the crowd, not in the guards, but in the queen herself, a subtle softening that did not weaken her presence but changed its direction, like a force choosing not to push. Her ears angled forward another fraction, the movement, slight but unmistakable now, and Ethan had the distinct impression that whatever he had done had not been categorized as a mistake in the way he expected. She stepped closer, closing the remaining space until he could see the fine detail along the edges of her features, the controlled stillness that defined her, the precision of someone who never moved without intent. "Then understand this," she said quietly, her voice low enough that it should not have carried, yet it did, reaching every corner of the chamber without effort. "Words spoken without intent often reveal more than those chosen carefully. The statement lingered, not as a conclusion, but as an opening, and Ethan felt the weight of it settle somewhere deeper than the moment itself, because it suggested that what had just happened was not over, not resolved, but just beginning. Behind him, somewhere in the chamber, a device resumed its faint hum, as if reality had finally decided to continue, but the stillness remained, held in place by something far more deliberate than silence. And as Queen Lyra studied him with that same impossible focus, Ethan realized with a quiet, unsettling certainty that he had not simply survived the mistake, he had been noticed for it. The chamber did not return to normal, not completely, because once something impossible had been introduced into a system built on precision, it did not simply disappear, it lingered, recalibrating everything around it. And Ethan could feel that recalibration happening in real time, subtle shifts in posture, attention bending toward him in ways that should not have been possible for someone whose entire strategy had always been to remain unnoticed. He kept his stance steady, resisting the very human instinct to step back, because distance now would not reduce the tension, it would define it, and he had the distinct sense that Queen Lyra would notice the difference. She remained close, close enough that her presence was no longer an abstract force across the room, but something immediate, measured in inches and awareness, and when she moved again, it was not away, but slightly to the side, circling just enough to change the angle from which she observed him, as if a different perspective might reveal something the first had not. "You correct tension," she said, her voice calm, carrying easily without effort. With familiarity, even when it is not permitted. It was not phrased as criticism, which made it harder to answer, because correction implied a boundary, and she had not yet drawn one. Ethan allowed a faint breath to leave him, controlled, deliberate, buying himself a second to think without appearing to hesitate, and then answered with the same quiet honesty that had gotten him into this situation in the first place. "Permission usually arrives after the moment it is needed," he said, his tone steady, the hint of dry humor present but restrained. "Humans tend to act first and adjust later." A faint ripple moved through the chamber again, not loud, not disruptive, but noticeable in the way several figures shifted their weight or adjusted their focus. The kind of reaction people had when something unexpected continued to not resolve itself. Queen Lyra's gaze did not waver, but something in it sharpened further, not in displeasure, but in interest that was becoming increasingly difficult to categorize as neutral. "And you believe adjustment is still possible," she said. Ethan considered that carefully, because this was no longer about recovering from a mistake. It was about understanding what the mistake had changed, and whether that change was reversible. "I believe," he said slowly, choosing each word with precision now, "that adjustment depends on whether the outcome is considered a problem." The statement settled into the space between them with a different kind of weight, not disruptive, but deliberate, and for a moment the chamber seemed to narrow, as if everything outside of that exchange had become secondary. Queen Lyra studied him in silence, her expression composed, her posture unchanged, but the stillness around her felt different now, less like control imposed on the environment and more like attention focused through it. Her ears shifted again, the movement subtle but unmistakable, angling in a way that suggested evaluation had moved into a new phase, one that did not rely solely on protocol. "You assume," she said quietly, "that I have not already determined the outcome." The words were not threatening, but they carried a certainty that made it clear she was not asking for his opinion. She was measuring his understanding. Ethan felt the edge of that statement, not as pressure, but as a boundary he was being invited to recognize, and perhaps, carefully, approach. "If you had," he replied, his voice even, "I would not still be standing here." The logic was simple, almost obvious, but in a room where most things were filtered through layers of formality, simplicity had its own impact. For a brief moment, something changed in Queen Lyra's expression, not enough to be called a smile, not enough to be easily defined, but present, a slight shift at the corner of her mouth that suggested the answer had aligned with something she had already considered. Behind them, the chamber began to breathe again, systems resuming their quiet functions, light continuing its slow movement overhead. But the attention did not disperse, it held, anchored to the interaction that had now clearly moved beyond its original context. Queen Lyra turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the presence of the court without fully disengaging from Ethan, and the effect was immediate, the room straightening in response, waiting for instruction, for resolution, for the restoration of order. Instead, she did something else entirely. She extended her hand, not in command, not in dismissal, but in a gesture that did not match any protocol Ethan recognized. Her fingers relaxed, her posture unchanged, and for a fraction of a second, the chamber seemed to hesitate again, as if uncertain how to interpret what it was witnessing. "Walk with me," she said, her voice calm, absolute, carrying not as a request, but as a decision already made. And in that moment, Ethan understood that whatever line he had crossed earlier had not been closed behind him. It had opened something, and now he was being asked, very deliberately, to step further inside. There was a precise moment, no longer than a heartbeat, where Ethan considered not moving, not out of defiance but out of instinct, because everything in his experience told him that when a queen changed the rules of a room without explaining them, the safest place to be was exactly where you already stood. But the way Queen Lyra held her hand, steady and unhurried, made it clear that hesitation would not preserve distance. It would define it, and distance, at this point, had become something she was actively removing. So he stepped forward, closing the final gap between them, aware that every eye in the chamber followed the movement with the kind of focus usually reserved for events that would later be recorded, analyzed, and quietly discussed in rooms he would never be invited into. Her hand did not grip his, did not guide him in any overt way, but as he matched her pace, it became obvious that the gesture had not been symbolic, it had been functional, an unspoken agreement that he would move with her rather than be directed from afar. The chamber parted around them without command, not because anyone had been told to step aside, but because the presence of the queen created its own path. And now, unexpectedly, Ethan found himself within that path, a detail that did not go unnoticed by anyone watching. The architecture seemed to respond as they moved, light shifting subtly ahead of them, the ambient hum adjusting its tone as if recalibrating to a new configuration, and Ethan had the distinct impression that the space itself was acknowledging a change it did not fully understand. They passed beneath an archway that had not been visible before, its surface smooth and reflective in a way that suggested it was less a door and more a decision. And as they crossed its threshold, the sounds of the main chamber softened, not silenced, but distanced, like a conversation moved just out of reach. The corridor beyond was quieter, narrower, designed with the same organic precision, but without the performative scale. And for the first time since this began, Ethan felt the shift from public to private, a transition that carried its own kind of weight. Queen Lyra did not release the pace she had set, and Ethan matched it easily, his mind working through possibilities with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that whatever came next would not follow any script he recognized. After several steps, she spoke, not turning to face him, her gaze forward, her voice calm but no longer projected for an audience. "You are aware," she said, "that what you did cannot be categorized within standard protocol." The statement was simple, but it carried layers of implication that extended far beyond the words themselves. Ethan allowed a small exhale, more thoughtful than relieved, and answered without breaking stride. "I am becoming increasingly aware of that," he said, the dry edge in his tone subtle but present, enough to acknowledge the situation without attempting to minimize it. A faint shift in her posture suggested she had registered the response, not as humor, but as consistency, and that seemed to matter. They continued for a few more steps in silence, the kind that did not press but observed, until she slowed, just slightly, enough to signal a change without announcing it. "Tell me," she said, and now she did turn, her attention returning to him fully. "In your world, when you address someone with familiarity, what does it signify?" The question was direct, but it was not idle. It was precise in a way that suggested she was not asking for a definition, but for a truth. Ethan met her gaze, aware that the corridor held no witnesses in the same way the chamber had. But that did not make the moment less significant, it made it more focused. He considered the question, not searching for the correct answer, but for the honest one, because anything else would have been immediately obvious. It depends on context, he said, choosing his words carefully. But usually it means trust, or the assumption of it. Sometimes it is used to create closeness where it does not exist yet. He paused briefly, then added. And sometimes it reveals that closeness already does, whether it should or not. The words settled between them with a different kind of weight than before, not amplified by a room, but sharpened by proximity. Queen Lyra studied him in silence, her expression unreadable in the way that suggested it was not empty, but controlled, and after a moment, something shifted. Again, subtle, precise, but unmistakable. Then you chose, she said quietly, to assume a position that has not been granted. It was not accusation, but it was not neutral either. It was a boundary being defined in real time. Ethan held her gaze, aware that this was the point where most people would correct themselves, step back, re-establish distance, and return to something safer. Instead, he answered with the same steady clarity he had used from the beginning. I did not choose it, he said. I revealed it. And for the first time since they had left the chamber, the silence that followed did not feel like a pause. It felt like a shift. The word lingered longer than it should have, not because it was unclear, but because it fit too well in a place where it should not have existed at all. And Ethan saw the exact moment Queen Lyra registered that difference, not as surprise, but as recalibration. Her gaze did not harden, did not withdraw. Instead, it settled more precisely on him, as if adjusting focus on something that had just moved from background to foreground without permission. The corridor remained quiet, but it was not empty of attention, the walls themselves carrying a faint resonance, like distant systems listening without interfering. And Ethan had the distinct impression that privacy here was not the absence of observation, but the absence of interruption. Queen Lyra stepped closer again, not enough to invade space, but enough to remove any illusion of distance, her posture still composed, her presence controlled, yet directed now with unmistakable intent. Revealed, she repeated softly, as if testing the word against something internal rather than questioning him directly. You speak as though the structure was already in place. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of tension, but to keep his thoughts aligned, because this conversation had moved beyond correction and into something far less defined, and he understood instinctively that clarity now mattered more than caution. In my experience, he said, voice even, structures like that usually exist before anyone acknowledges them. We just do not notice until something disrupts the pattern. A faint shift passed through her expression, subtle but real, not agreement, not dismissal, something closer to recognition without admission. Her ears angled forward again, the movement now consistent enough that Ethan no longer mistook it for coincidence. And for a brief moment, the silence between them felt less like a pause and more like a shared observation. And you believe, she said, her tone still measured but carrying a different weight now, that you disrupted something that was already present. The question was precise, but it was not framed to trap him. It was framed to confirm something she had already begun to consider. Ethan held her gaze, aware that the safest answer would be to step back, to reframe, to reduce the implication of what he had said. But the situation had moved past safety several minutes ago, and retreat now would not restore anything. It would only contradict what had already been established. I think, he replied carefully, that if it had not been there, the reaction would have been different. The logic was simple, but it carried a conclusion neither of them had stated directly. And for a moment, the corridor seemed to narrow further, not physically, but in focus, everything outside of that exchange becoming irrelevant. Queen Lyra did not respond immediately, and in that delay, Ethan saw the shift more clearly than before, not in her posture, which remained controlled, but in the way her attention settled, less like evaluation and more like consideration. She turned slightly, pacing a single step away, then back, a movement so controlled it almost seemed unnecessary, except that it changed the angle of the moment, introduced motion into a space that had been entirely still. In my world, she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, not projected, not intended for anyone beyond him. Positions are not assumed. They are granted, defined, reinforced. She paused, her gaze returning to him with the same precise focus. They do not appear without cause. Ethan listened, understanding that this was not correction, it was clarification, a statement of how things were supposed to function, and by extension, how what had just happened did not fit within that system. He nodded once, acknowledging the structure without challenging it, because denying it would have been pointless. Then this would be the exception, he said, the words calm, unforced, offered without emphasis, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle into the space between them with more weight than anything more elaborate could have carried. For a fraction of a second, something changed again, not visible in any obvious way, but present in the way the air itself seemed to shift, like a held breath finally released. Queen Lyra's gaze held his, steady, unreadable to anyone who did not know what to look for. But Ethan had been watching closely enough to recognize the pattern now, the subtle transitions, the micro shifts that signaled movement beneath control. Exceptions, she said softly, require justification. The statement was not a threat, but it was not neutral either. It was a boundary presented with the expectation of response. Ethan considered that, aware that whatever he said next would not simply answer her. It would define his position within a system that did not yet know where to place him. Then I will provide one, he said, his voice steady. His posture unchanged, not stepping forward, not stepping back, meeting her exactly where she stood, and for the first time since this began, the tension did not spike, it aligned, as if something that had been uncertain had just found its direction. Queen Lyra did not answer immediately, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was deliberate, shaped by her control rather than the absence of words, and Ethan recognized the difference now. The way pauses here were not gaps but decisions in progress. She studied him with a level of focus that did not waver, as if weighing not just his statement, but the structure behind it, the consistency, the risk, the absence of retreat, and for a brief moment, Ethan had the distinct impression that this was not about a mistake anymore. It was about whether he would maintain the same alignment under pressure. Then explain it, she said finally, her voice calm, measured, but carrying an expectation that did not need to be emphasized, because it was already understood. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of hesitation, but to settle his thoughts into something precise. Because whatever he said now would not simply justify a word, it would define the reason it had not been rejected. You asked what familiarity signifies, he began, his tone steady, not defensive, not overly careful, just clear, and I said it can create closeness or reveal it. He paused briefly, not for effect, but because the next part mattered more than the first. When I spoke, the reaction was not rejection, it was recognition, not from you alone, but from the room. Everything paused, not because the word was wrong, but because it did not fit what they expected to hear. The corridor seemed to narrow, again around the statement, not physically, but in focus, as if the space itself was listening more closely now. Queen Lyra did not interrupt, her gaze fixed on him with that same precise intensity. But something beneath it had shifted again, not softer, not weaker, but more engaged, as if the explanation had aligned with something she had already observed but not yet named. You are suggesting, she said quietly, that the disruption revealed a pattern that had not been acknowledged. It was not a challenge, it was a refinement of his argument, and Ethan recognized it immediately. Yes, he said simply, because anything more would have diluted the point, and simplicity here seemed to carry more weight than elaboration. A moment passed, and in that moment, the stillness between them changed again, less like a barrier, more like a shared space, defined not by distance, but by attention. Queen Lyra stepped closer once more, closing the gap until there was no ambiguity left in the interaction, her presence controlled but directed fully at him now. And for the first time since this began, Ethan became aware of something else beneath the tension, something quieter, more difficult to categorize, but unmistakably present. And what? She asked, her voice lower now, not projected, not intended for anyone beyond him. Does that pattern suggest? The question was precise, but it was not neutral. It carried a weight that extended beyond logic into something far more personal. And Ethan understood instinctively that this was no longer about systems or protocols. It was about interpretation. He held her gaze, aware that this was the point where most people would retreat into safer ground, deflect, generalize, reduce. but none of those would align with what had already been established. And misalignment now would be more obvious than any mistake he could have made earlier. It suggests, he said slowly, choosing each word, with care but not hesitation, that the difference between what is permitted and what is possible is not always the same. The statement settled into the space between them with a different kind of weight, not disruptive, not challenging, but steady, like something that did not need to force itself to be recognized. Queen Lyra did not respond immediately, and in that pause, Ethan saw it again. The shift, subtle but undeniable. The way her attention held not as authority evaluating a subject, but as something more focused, more deliberate, as if the boundaries she had defined earlier were no longer fixed points, but variables. Her ears angled forward slightly more, the movement now clear enough that it no longer required interpretation, and for a brief moment, the silence between them felt less like tension and more like alignment. "You speak," she said after a moment, her tone calm, but carrying a new layer beneath it, as though you were already operating within that possibility. It was not a question, but it invited one, and Ethan recognized it immediately. "I am," he replied, without stepping back, without softening the statement, because anything less would have contradicted everything he had already said. And for the first time since the corridor had separated them from the chamber, the air did not tighten in response. It steadied, as if something uncertain had just been resolved into a direction neither of them had fully expected, but both now understood was no longer avoidable. For a moment, nothing changed, and that was the most significant change of all, because in a place where every word was supposed to trigger correction or reinforcement, the absence of either meant something had shifted beyond the system's ability to categorize it. Queen Lyra held his gaze without interruption, her posture unchanged, her presence still precise, but the focus behind it no longer felt like evaluation alone. It felt like recognition moving into acceptance, though not yet declared. Ethan remained exactly where he was, not advancing, not retreating, because movement now would not clarify anything, it would distort it. An instinct told him that stillness was the only way to match what was happening in front of him. The corridor seemed quieter than before, not because the systems had powered down, but because attention had narrowed to a point where everything else became secondary, like background noise fading when something more important demanded focus. Queen Lyra's eyes traced his expression with measured intent, not searching for weakness, but for inconsistency, and finding none, she allowed a small shift in her stance, subtle enough that it would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it, but unmistakable to him now. "You maintain alignment," she said softly, her voice carrying less authority and more precision, "even when the position is not confirmed." It was not praise, but it was not neutral either. It was acknowledgement, and in this context, that carried more weight than approval. Ethan inclined his head slightly, not as submission, but as recognition of the statement, because anything more would have disrupted the balance they had established. "If the position changes when it is challenged," he replied, his tone steady, "then it was never stable to begin with." The words settled into the space between them with quiet certainty, not forceful, not defensive, but anchored, and for a brief moment, the corridor seemed to respond, the faint hum of the systems aligning with a steadier rhythm, as if something uncertain had just resolved into structure. Queen Lyra watched him closely, her expression still controlled, but now layered with something more difficult to define, not softness, not distance, something closer to decision forming beneath restraint. She stepped closer again, reducing the space between them until it was no longer a factor, her presence no longer something he observed, but something he was within. "In my world," she said, her voice lower now, more contained, "positions that are not granted are corrected." The statement was clear, not as a warning, but as a principle, one that had governed everything up to this point. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation, aware that this was the moment where that principle would either reassert itself or be redefined. "Then correct it," he said, the words calm, unforced, offered without resistance, because resistance would have contradicted everything he had already established, and acceptance, in this case, was not submission, it was consistency. The silence that followed was different again, not tense, not uncertain, but focused, as if the next movement would define more than just the outcome of this conversation. Queen Lyra studied him for a long moment, her attention unwavering, her expression unreadable to anyone without context. And then, instead of stepping back, instead of restoring distance, she did the opposite. She reached out, her hand moving with the same controlled precision that defined everything she did, and rested her fingers lightly against his wrist, not gripping, not restraining, just enough contact to establish something undeniable. The gesture was small, almost insignificant in isolation, but in this context, it carried a weight that shifted everything. Because it was not correction, it was selection. The air in the corridor seemed to still completely, not in anticipation of consequence, but in recognition of change. And Ethan felt it as clearly as if it had been announced aloud. Queen Lyra held that contact for exactly one heartbeat, long enough to make it real, then released it without withdrawing her attention. "If it is to remain," she said quietly, her voice steady, her gaze fixed on his, "then it will not be assumed." The words settled with deliberate clarity, not rejecting what had happened, but redefining it. She stepped back just enough to restore the space between them, but the distance no longer felt like separation. It felt like structure. "It will be acknowledged," she finished, and for the first time since this began, the direction of what they had started was no longer uncertain. It was inevitable. The corridor did not remain still for long, not because something disrupted it, but because Queen Lyra had already decided what came next, and in a place like this, decisions did not wait for agreement. They shaped reality around them. She turned without hesitation, her movement smooth and precise, and began walking back toward the chamber, not checking if Ethan would follow, because the expectation had already been established, and he matched her pace without question, aware that whatever had just shifted between them was no longer contained within private space. It was about to be brought into the open. The transition was immediate. The moment they crossed back beneath the archway, the chamber seemed to recognize her return, light adjusting, conversations halting mid-thought, attention snapping into place with practiced discipline. But this time, the focus did not settle solely on the queen. It divided, unmistakably, between her and the human walking beside her. Ethan felt it as clearly as a change in pressure, the weight of a room that had already witnessed one anomaly now bracing for another. And for the first time since this began, he understood that the silence here was no longer waiting for correction. It was waiting for confirmation. Queen Lyra did not resume her position at the elevated center of the chamber, did not restore the familiar distance that defined her authority. Instead, she stopped midway across the floor, choosing a place that did not belong to any established protocol, and turned to face the court. The effect was immediate, attention locking into place, posture aligning, the entire chamber recalibrating around a configuration that did not match any previous pattern. Ethan remained at her side, not behind, not offset, exactly aligned, and the awareness of that alignment moved through the room in a way that did not need to be spoken. For a brief moment, nothing happened, and then Queen Lyra spoke. "Proceed," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber with absolute clarity, directed not at Ethan, but at the assembly. "The discussion will continue." The instruction was simple, almost dismissive, but it did something far more significant than resume the negotiation. It established that nothing that had occurred had disrupted her authority, only altered its application. The delegates hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough to reveal uncertainty, then adjusted, voices returning carefully, cautiously, each word measured with renewed awareness, because now there was a variable in the room that had not existed before. Ethan listened, but he was no longer just observing. The conversation moved differently now, not because the topics had changed, but because the context had. And when a question arose, when a response required clarification, the attention did not default to the expected sources. It shifted, subtly but consistently, toward him. Queen Lyra allowed it, not overtly, not with instruction, but through absence of correction. And in this space, absence was permission. At one point, a senior delegate paused, uncertain, and glanced toward the queen, a silent request for guidance. And for the briefest moment, her gaze shifted, not to the delegate, but to Ethan. It was not a command, not even a visible signal. But it was enough. he answered, his voice steady. The same clarity as before, and the room accepted it. Not fully, not comfortably, but undeniably. The pattern reinforced itself with each exchange, small, precise, until it was no longer an anomaly, but a developing structure. Time passed, though it felt different now, less like endurance and more like progression. And when the discussion finally reached a natural pause, Queen Lyra stepped forward slightly, reclaiming the center of attention. With effortless precision, the chamber stilled again, not with uncertainty this time, but with expectation, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same controlled authority, but now with something new beneath it, something that did not belong to protocol. The position demonstrated here, she said, her gaze moving across the assembly, then settling, deliberately, on Ethan, will be recognized. The words were measured, formal, but they did not define the position in any traditional sense. They acknowledged it, which in this context carried far more weight. A ripple moved through the chamber, subtle but undeniable, the kind of reaction that followed something unprecedented being placed into a system that had no category for it. Queen Lyra did not elaborate, did not justify, because justification would have implied uncertainty, and there was none in her tone. Instead, she turned slightly, aligning herself once more beside Ethan, not above, not ahead, but beside, and the message in. That positioning was clearer than any declaration could have been. The chamber held that image, that alignment, that shift, and in the silence that followed, Ethan understood with absolute clarity that what had begun as a mistake had not been corrected, it had been confirmed, and whatever came next would not return to what it had been before.